Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going way back to 1948 to explore the creation of Israel, a pivotal moment in the Middle East. And wow, we've got some really thought-provoking material to work with today.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those events that continues to have major ripple effects, shaping the region even today. We're going to try and get to the heart of what made this event so significant.
We're going to look at the factors that led to Israel's creation, the immediate impact it had, and how it set the stage for so much of what we see in the Middle East today. You've shared some great sources with us, so let's dive right in.
Let's do it.
So first things first, we've got to understand the whole idea of Zionism. This term pops up all the time when talking about Israel. What exactly does it mean, and why is it so important to this story?
Right, so Zionism, basically, it was a movement of people who believed that Jewish people deserved their own independent nation, a homeland. And they specifically believed this homeland should be in the historical region known as Palestine.
And this wasn't just some random idea, right?
Absolutely not. It grew out of centuries of discrimination and persecution that Jewish communities faced in various parts of the world. Having their own state, they believed, would offer them safety and self-determination, like a chance to control their own destiny.
Okay, that makes sense. So Palestine, this historical region, what was it like back then? Because I'm guessing it wasn't just an empty space waiting for a new nation.
It definitely wasn't empty. Palestine was already a place with a diverse population. It had deep historical and religious significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In the early 20th century, before Israel was established, the majority of the people living there were Arab Palestinians. They had their own culture, traditions, and deep roots in the land.
But there was also a Jewish population living in Palestine, right?
Yeah, definitely. And this is where things get a bit more complex. The Jewish community in Palestine also had historical and religious connections to the land, going back centuries. So you had these two groups, both with claims and ties to the same territory.
It sounds like a recipe for tension right from the start.
You could say that. And this tension definitely played a role in how things unfolded. But before we jump too far ahead, there's this key moment in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. You heard of that?
Yeah, the Balfour Declaration. Wasn't that some kind of British promise about a Jewish homeland?
Exactly. The Balfour Declaration was a public statement by the British government during World War I. In it, they said they supported, and I'm quoting here, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
So basically, Britain saying, hey, we think there should be a Jewish state in Palestine.
In a nutshell, yes. But it's important to remember that this declaration also added that, quote, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
So trying to balance things out a bit, recognizing the rights of the Palestinians already living there.
Exactly. It was an attempt, at least on paper, to try and accommodate both sides. But realistically, it created a situation where you have two groups with competing claims and aspirations, both with some level of international support.
Okay, so that's a pretty crucial moment. Now let's fast forward a bit. World War II ends, and the United Nations comes into the picture. How does the UN get involved in all of this?
Good question. So after the horrors of World War II, there was this global push to prevent future conflicts and find peaceful ways to resolve international disputes. That's how the UN came about.
Makes sense. So more of a peacekeeping role.
Initially, yes. But as Britain's control over Palestine was ending, the conflict over who should control the territory became a major international issue. The UN was tasked with finding some kind of solution.
And I'm guessing their solution wasn't exactly simple.
Well, they came up with a plan, but it was definitely controversial. It's known as the Partition Plan of 1947.
So what was the big idea behind this partition plan?
Basically, the UN proposed to split Palestine into two separate states, one for Jewish people and one for Arab Palestinians. They also suggested that Jerusalem, being such a religiously important city for multiple faiths, should be under international control.
So kind of carving up the land and hoping everyone would be happy with their slice?
Sort of, but as you can imagine, it didn't go down too well with everyone. Jewish leaders generally accepted the plan. They saw it as a path to finally having their own independent state after years of struggle.
But what about the Palestinian Arabs?
They weren't too happy about it. They felt it was unfair to divide a land they'd lived in for generations and that it didn't really respect the rights of the majority Arab population.
So a recipe for even more tension.
Sadly, yes. And this tension boiled over in 1948 when Britain officially withdrew from Palestine.
Yeah.
Jewish leaders went ahead and declared the independence of the State of Israel.
And that's when the first major war breaks out, right?
Exactly. The very next day, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War began, with neighboring Arab countries joining forces to fight against the newly established Israel.
It sounds like chaos. What were the lasting impacts of this war?
The war had huge consequences. By the time the fighting ended, Israel had gained control of significantly more territory than what was originally allocated to them under the UN partition plan. This meant that many Arab Palestinians were displaced from their homes and became refugees.
And that displacement, it's still a major issue today, isn't it?
Absolutely. For Palestinians, this event, often referred to as the Nakba, meaning catastrophe, represents a massive loss and injustice. It's a wound that hasn't healed and continues to shape the conflict to this day.
So we've got the creation of Israel, the displacement of Palestinians, and the start of this conflict. But things don't stop there, right? The sources talk about a bunch of other events like the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, and the Yom Kippur War.
Right, and these events are super important to understand the ongoing story. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was this wild moment where Israel, along with Britain and France, actually invaded Egypt.
Why would they do that?
Well, Egypt had taken control of the Suez Canal, which was this incredibly important waterway for trade. Britain and France weren't too happy about it. And Israel saw an opportunity to weaken Egypt, which they saw as a threat.
So, basically a power grab.
Pretty much. But here's the thing. The United States and the Soviet Union, who were the real superpowers at the time, were furious about this invasion. They put a ton of pressure on Britain, France, and Israel to back down.
And did they?
They did, eventually. And that's what makes the Suez Crisis so interesting. It showed that the old colonial powers like Britain and France were losing their grip on the region, and the Middle East was becoming this new battleground for the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
It sounds like things were getting even more complicated.
They were. And then in 1967, we have the Six-Day War, which, as the name suggests, was super short, but incredibly intense.
What triggered that one?
The lead-up to the war was full of tension. Israel was feeling surrounded by hostile neighbors. They saw an Egyptian military buildup as a serious threat and decided to launch a preemptive attack.
Preemptive, meaning?
Meaning they struck first before Egypt could attack them.
Bold move.
It was, and it turned out to be a decisive victory for Israel. They captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria.
Wow, so in 6 days, the map of the region totally changed.
Yeah, and the impact of this war was huge,
Yeah.
especially for the Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza, who now came under Israeli control. It added another layer of complexity to this whole conflict.
And then just a few years later, another war.
Right, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. This time, it was Egypt and Syria who launched a surprise attack on Israel, catching them off guard on Yom Kippur, a very holy day for Jewish people.
What happened in that one?
This war was a bit different. While Israel did eventually push back the attack and win, they suffered much heavier losses early on. It was a shock, especially after their swift victory in 1967.
So wake-up call for Israel.
In a way, yes. The Yom Kippur War had some pretty big consequences. It led to this global oil crisis, as Arab oil-producing nations used oil as a political weapon. And it really intensified international efforts to try and find a peaceful solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which everyone realized was just not sustainable.
So we've talked about the wars, but what about the Palestinian perspective? How are they organizing themselves during all of this?
Well, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was formed.
And what was their goal?
The PLO aimed to represent the Palestinian people on a global stage and fight for their right to self-determination. Their initial goal was the liberation of Palestine, which for them meant establishing a Palestinian state in the entire territory of what was then Israel.
So a very different vision from the idea of two separate states.
Yes, quite different. And this difference in visions was at the heart of the conflict. Then, in the late 80s and early 2000s, we have these two Palestinian uprisings known as the Intifadas.
Yeah, the Intifadas. These were major moments of Palestinian resistance, weren't they?
Definitely. The first Intifada started in 1987 and lasted for several years. It involved widespread civil disobedience, things like protests, boycotts, and some lower-level violence. It was really a powerful expression of Palestinian frustration with the Israeli occupation.
And wasn't there a second one?
Yes, the Second Intifada erupted in 2000. This one was much more violent, with increased clashes between Palestinians and Israeli forces, as well as suicide bombings and other attacks.
Wow, so the conflict was escalating.
Sadly, yes. The Second Intifada marked a really dark period in the conflict, with significant casualties on both sides and a further deepening of the divide.
It's a lot to take in. We've covered so much ground here, from the early ideas of Zionism to these major wars and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. Looking back at it all, what would you say is the most important thing to understand about the creation of Israel and its impact on the Middle East?
I think the main takeaway is that the creation of Israel in 1948 was this massive turning point, a real watershed moment in the history of the Middle East. It fulfilled the aspirations of many Jewish people who longed for a homeland after centuries of hardship. But it also led to the displacement of many Palestinians and triggered this ongoing conflict that's had such a profound impact on the region.
So it's not just about one event in 1948, but about this chain reaction that's still unfolding.
Exactly. It fundamentally reshaped the political map, triggered these major wars, and created a deeply complex web of political, social, and humanitarian issues that we're still grappling with today.
It's fascinating to think about how these events from decades ago continue to shape the world we live in. The sources you shared really highlight how global forces intersected with these deep personal beliefs and historical claims, leading to these lasting consequences.
Totally. And looking back at all of this, what stood out to you the most? What made you think differently or question things you might have taken for granted about this part of the world?
And for all of you listening, here's something to consider as you continue exploring this topic. How does the story of Israel's creation and its aftermath compare to other situations in history where new nations were formed in territories that were already inhabited by other people? Can you see similar patterns of migration, conflict, and the struggle for identity? Thinking about these connections might help us understand the complexities of the Middle East in a new light. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.